The Sodder house stood on a quiet hillside in Fayette County, West Virginia, wrapped in winter darkness. Christmas Eve 1945 was calm, too calm. Snow rested lightly on the ground, untouched, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Inside lived George Sodder, a man who never believed in silence. Born Giuseppe Soddo in Sardinia, Italy, George had fled poverty and old-world fear as a teenager. America gave him a new name, a new life, and a booming coal trucking business. What it did not give him was caution. George spoke his mind freely, especially about politics and especially about one man, Benito Mussolini. While many Italian immigrants admired the dictator, George hated him openly. He argued in public, insulted supporters, and called Mussolini a criminal without fear. In a town where loyalties ran deep, George's words traveled fast and not everyone forgave. In the summer of 1945, a stranger came to the Sodder home claiming to sell life insurance. When George refused, the man's face darkened. His voice dropped. He warned George that his house would burn and his children would suffer because of his dirty mouth against Mussolini. George laughed and shut the door. Weeks later, strange things began to happen. The Sodders' phone line was mysteriously cut. A man was seen watching the house from the road. Another neighbor later admitted seeing someone throwing something onto the Sodder roof that December night. George ignored it all. On Christmas Eve, the family celebrated late. Laughter filled the house. 5 of the children chose to sleep upstairs. Around midnight, a strange phone call woke Jenny Sodder, a laughing woman asking for the wrong name. Then silence. At 1:30 a.m., smoke filled the house. Flames climbed the walls with unnatural speed. George tried to save his children, but the ladder was gone. The truck wouldn't start, and the stairs were already burning. Neighbors watched helplessly as the house collapsed into fire. By morning, 5 children were gone. No bodies were found, only ashes and questions. Morning light revealed what the fire had erased. The Sodder home was gone, reduced to a grey mound of ash and twisted metal. George stood motionless, staring at the ruins, waiting for something no one else could see, bones, teeth, anything that proved his children had died there. Nothing appeared. Local officials arrived quickly. Too quickly. The fire chief declared the blaze accidental before the ashes were even cool. The cause, he said, was faulty wiring. George felt the lie settle into the air. He asked a simple question. Where are my children's remains? The answer came back rehearsed. The fire burned too hot. George knew coal fires. He hauled fuel for a living. He knew what heat could and could not do. Household fires did not erase bones completely. Not 5 bodies. Not without a trace. Still, officials insisted. Death certificates were prepared. A mass burial was suggested. George refused. Days later, the coroner conducted a cursory search. He found nothing. No skull fragments. No teeth, no bone shards. Then strangely, he closed the case. The Sodders were told to move on. But new details began to surface. A neighbor claimed she saw a man throwing a glowing object onto the Sodder roof the night of the fire. Another reported seeing children in a passing car shortly after the flames began. Children who looked frightened, alive. George demanded answers. Instead, he was met with resistance. The fire chief quietly admitted something unsettling. The faulty wiring explanation was false. The wiring had been inspected months earlier and found safe. The chief later recanted his statement, then suddenly left town. George began to understand. This was not incompetence. It was avoidance. When he tried to dig deeper, officials warned him not to stir trouble. Friends stopped visiting. Conversations ended when he entered a room. In Fayette County, George Sodder had become a problem, and problems were often silenced. One investigator suggested the children might have been kidnapped, then immediately withdrew the theory. Another said George should be grateful he still had some children left. That night, George returned to the ashes alone. He sifted through the debris with his bare hands. Beneath the rubble, he found something impossible, a small unburned object, proof that the fire hadn't done what they claimed, and proof that someone didn't want the truth found. George Sodder no longer trusted anyone. The ashes had told him more truth than the authorities ever did. In the days following the fire, he searched the ruins himself, again and again. What he found only deepened his suspicion. A household fire, no matter how fierce, left evidence behind. Yet there was almost nothing. No bones, no teeth. No trace of 5 human lives. Then came the quiet discovery. While sifting through debris, George uncovered something small and intact, an object that should not have survived if the fire had burned. As hot as officials claimed, it was proof that the blaze had not reached the temperatures needed to destroy bodies completely. Someone had lied. George began asking harder questions. He learned that the Sodder phone line had been cut deliberately, not damaged by flames. A repairman confirmed it had been severed before the fire. The missing ladder was later found thrown into a nearby ravine. The family's truck, which refused to start that night, started perfectly the next day. Nothing about the fire was accidental. More witnesses came forward, quietly. One woman claimed she saw the missing Sodder children in a car traveling toward Charleston hours after the fire. Another reported seeing a group of people near the house earlier that evening, watching. Yet none of this appeared in official reports. When George confronted local authorities, doors closed. He was told the case was finished. He was warned to stop spreading false hope. One official suggested the children had run away, a cruel idea that made no sense. George began to suspect something darker. He remembered the insurance salesman, the threat, the warning that his children would be destroyed because of his words. He remembered his arguments about Mussolini, spoken loudly, publicly, without fear. Now fear had come to his doorstep. Determined not to let his children be erased, George placed a billboard along Route 16. It displayed photographs of the 5 missing children and offered a reward for information. Drivers slowed. People stared. Some turned away. Then a letter arrived. It had no return address. Inside was a message warning George to stop searching or suffer more loss. For the first time since the fire, George felt what his enemies had intended all along. Silence enforced by terror. But George Sodder had never been a silent man, and he was only just beginning. The billboard changed everything. It stood tall along Route 16, impossible to ignore. 5 children's faces staring out at passing cars, asking the same silent question. Have you seen us? George offered a reward, then doubled it. He refused to let memory fade, and slowly whispers returned. A woman from a nearby town claimed she saw the Sodder children at a roadside diner the morning after the fire. They were with 2 adults, she said. Foreign accents, tense behavior. Another witness reported seeing children, matching their descriptions, boarding a bus headed south. George wrote everything down, dates, names, places. When he approached law enforcement again, they dismissed the sightings as fantasy. Grieving minds, they said, created false hope. But George noticed something troubling. None of the claims were properly investigated. Then came the letter, postmarked from Kentucky. It described a group of children traveling with strangers shortly after Christmas. It mentioned Italian-speaking adults. The writer urged George to keep searching. Jenny clung to the letter as proof their children lived. George felt something colder, purpose. He hired a private investigator. The man followed leads through West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. He uncovered rumors of children hidden with sympathetic families, possibly sent overseas. But before the investigator could complete his work, he vanished from contact. No final report was ever delivered. Weeks later, George learned the investigator had abruptly quit the case without explanation. Another door closed. Years passed, but the Sodders never moved. They turned the ruins into a memorial. Flowers were planted. Photographs were refreshed on the billboard. The town avoided the place, as if the land itself carried guilt. Then, in 1967, more than 20 years later, a letter arrived. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his 20s. On the back, 4 words were written in shaky handwriting. Louis Sodder. I love Brother Frankie. Louis was one of the 5 children. George's hands trembled as he stared at the face in the photo. The eyes were familiar, too familiar. George held the photograph as if it were the only piece of truth left in the world. The young man stared back at him, eyes wide. Hair dark, the unmistakable Sodder resemblance. For the first time in more than 2 decades, George felt the spark of hope that had refused to die in the ashes of that Christmas Eve fire. Jenny, ever cautious, feared heartbreak. It could be a mistake, she whispered, her voice trembling. But George refused to be swayed. Every instinct screamed that this was one of his missing children. He began tracking the postmark, trying to find the sender. The letter offered no name, no address, only the image and those 4 haunting words. It was enough to reignite a search that had grown cold. George reached out to law enforcement again. This time his inquiries were met with strange resistance. Reports vanished, files were misplaced, and FBI agents claimed jurisdictional issues. One agent, speaking quietly off the record, hinted at suspicious circumstances surrounding the original fire, then abruptly left the conversation. George realized the truth he was chasing was inconvenient. Too inconvenient for the authorities who claimed to serve justice. Neighbors whispered rumors too. People who had once avoided the Sodder property now claimed to have seen strange activity near the ruins, strangers lingering, unusual vehicles parked for hours, and shadowy figures in the surrounding woods. Each account added layers to a story that refused to remain silent, one that George could no longer ignore. Despite the obstacles, George refused to back down. He hired another investigator, someone discreet, someone not easily intimidated. Their first leads pointed to a possible network moving children through West Virginia and neighboring states, a terrifying thought. It suggested that the fire may have been only the first act in a far more sinister plan. Each new discovery increased the danger. Threatening phone calls resumed. Anonymous notes warned him to stop digging. One ominous message appeared on his door. "You'll lose more if you keep looking. Leave it buried where it belongs." George did not stop. He could not stop. For him, the fire had never been just a tragedy. It was a warning, a message that speaking out had consequences, and someone powerful was willing to act on them. By the end of that year, George was convinced of a terrifying truth. The fire had been deliberately set. The children may have survived, and those responsible were watching, always watching. He had made enemies, and those enemies had orchestrated events with precision and cruelty. And yet, in the dark of his grief and the shadows of his loss, George Sodder vowed something. He would not be silenced. Not by fire, not by fear, not by the unseen hands manipulating fate. George Sodder had always believed that truth was a weapon, but now he realized it was also a target painted on his back. Every lead about his missing children seemed to draw new eyes, new threats. Whoever had orchestrated the fire was still active, and they were patient. He began noticing unusual activity around the Sodder property. Cars idled along the roadside at odd hours. Strange faces appeared in the nearby woods. A neighbor reported seeing men taking notes and photographing the ruins under the cover of darkness. George, never one to panic, armed himself with vigilance and a sense of purpose sharpened by grief. Then came the letters. More anonymous notes arrived, typed, handwritten, and some written in Italian. The messages were clear: stop searching or you will regret it. One letter even included a charred fragment of paper, suggesting a warning that mimicked the fire itself. George understood instantly this was no random threat. It was personal. His children had vanished 21 years earlier, and now the forces behind it were making sure he knew. Their reach extended far beyond a single night. George began connecting dots from the past. He remembered arguments in the local Italian community, men he had openly criticized for supporting Mussolini, the strangers he had seen lingering at the house before the fire, the insurance salesman who had come and delivered a chilling prophecy. Enemies had been made long before the flames consumed his home, and the fire was only the beginning. Determined to fight back, George enlisted a private investigator with knowledge of underground networks and missing persons cases. The investigator discovered disturbing connections. Children had been trafficked through secret channels in West Virginia, and local officials seemed to turn a blind eye. It became evident that George was up against a network with influence, money, and deadly patience. One night, George found his car tires slashed and a handwritten message tucked under the windshield. "You should have stayed silent. Most men would have quit then. Most men would have fled." Not George. Anger fueled him. Fear sharpened him. Every threat reinforced the truth he had been chasing. The children were alive, and someone powerful had planned to keep them hidden. George Sodder had spent his life speaking loudly. Now louder was necessary, because the shadow of the fire had grown, and the enemies in it were determined to finish what they had started 21 years ago. George Sodder refused to accept the official story. The fire, the missing children, the silence of authorities, it all pointed to one conclusion. Someone had orchestrated the disaster, and the children were taken intentionally. Every day without answers felt like a dagger in his heart. But George's determination grew sharper with each new clue. Sightings became more frequent. Farmers along remote back roads claimed to see children matching the Sodder siblings, descriptions with unfamiliar adults. In Charleston, a waitress at a diner recalled seeing 5 children, frightened, with adults who spoke Italian, ordering food quietly and leaving in a black sedan. George collected every account, Every detail, no matter how minor. He knew that somewhere these fragments of information would converge. Yet every lead came with threats. Anonymous calls whispered, "Stop digging, or there will be consequences." Once, a car followed George home for hours, its headlights glaring into the night. The message was clear. His search made him a target. And still George pressed forward. He attempted to confront known enemies in the Italian-American community, men who had supported Mussolini and had openly criticized him for his outspoken views. Some denied involvement, but a few grew hostile, refusing even polite conversation. George realized that decades-old grudges had transformed into dangerous alliances. Political tension, personal vengeance, and dark secrecy had fused into something lethal. A breakthrough came when a private investigator discovered a network of foster homes and orphanages across Kentucky and Ohio where children from disrupted families were sent. Several accounts suggested the possibility that George's children had been moved through this clandestine system. It was a lead that filled George with both hope and dread. If his children were alive, they were being hidden systematically, and the people responsible had power, money, and patience beyond his imagining. Late one night, George gathered his family. They huddled around a table in the ruins of the old house. Maps, photographs, and letters were spread across its surface. The plan was dangerous. George would trace the movements of his children, following the smallest of clues, risking confrontation with those who had orchestrated the fire. But he had no choice. Silence had failed him before. Action was the only path left. As George prepared to leave for the first leg of this desperate search, he noticed movement at the edge of the ruins. Shadows flitted between trees, fleeting but deliberate. He was being watched again. Someone wanted to ensure that George never reached the truth. The fire had been the first warning. Now the threat was present, immediate and unmistakable. And yet, for the first time in over 2 decades, hope burned in George Sodder's chest. Somewhere out there, his children were alive. Somewhere out there, the answers waited, if he was brave enough to reach them. George Sodder's search had become relentless. Every lead, every whisper, every rumor was a thread he was determined to follow, even if it led him into danger. He refused to let fear dictate the fate of his children. 2 decades of unanswered questions had only sharpened his resolve. The first breakthrough came unexpectedly. A neighbor, long silent, finally admitted seeing children resembling the Sodder siblings shortly after the fire. They had been accompanied by 2 adults in a dark vehicle. The neighbor described their frightened expressions, their constant glances over their shoulders, as if they were being coerced or monitored. This sighting matched several earlier accounts George had gathered. It was proof. The fire hadn't claimed the lives of all 5 children. George's investigation now shifted to tracing this network of hidden children. Private investigators and sympathetic locals uncovered a series of foster homes, orphanages, and temporary housing in Ohio and Kentucky where displaced or trafficked children were placed. George compiled maps, timelines, and names, but every time he closed in, obstacles appeared. Files disappeared, letters went unanswered, and law enforcement insisted the cases were cold or unverified. Then came the threats, more specific, more sinister. One note arrived in his mailbox, written in hurried, jagged script. "Stop looking or the next fire will be yours." George knew the warning was credible. Whoever had orchestrated the 1945 blaze had influence, reach, and a chilling willingness to act. But he refused to back down. A cryptic clue surfaced in a small town in Kentucky. A local man, fearing retaliation, whispered that he had seen children matching the Sodder description attending a church service, with adults who didn't appear to be relatives. George immediately recognized the pattern. The children were being deliberately hidden, moved carefully, and constantly monitored. Despite the danger, George began visiting towns personally, asking questions, showing photographs, and offering rewards. Locals started to recognize the determination in his eyes, the kind of determination no threat could shake. Slowly, fragments of information came together, painting a chilling picture. The Sodder children had survived, but they had been kidnapped, deliberately separated, and their locations concealed by a network of adults whose loyalty lay not with the law, but with secrecy, fear, and vengeance. As he prepared for a winter journey into neighboring states to trace the next lead, George noticed something that made his blood run cold. Footprints in the fresh snow around the ruins of his home. They were recent, They circled the perimeter of the property, then disappeared into the darkness. Someone was watching. Someone was aware of every move he made. And yet, George's heart burned with a single unwavering thought. I will find my children. No one will stop me. George Sodder's search had grown increasingly perilous. The trail of his missing children led him into remote towns, abandoned farmhouses, and darkened forests where he could feel eyes watching his every move. Threats escalated, anonymous phone calls, notes slipped under doors, and shadowy figures trailing him on quiet roads. It was clear. The network that orchestrated the 1945 fire was still active, and they would not allow him to uncover the truth without resistance. One night, following a tip about a supposed foster home in Kentucky, George arrived under cover of darkness. The building was old, abandoned, but he noticed faint light from a window upstairs. A door creaked. Figures moved inside. He approached cautiously, realizing he was being observed, but not by strangers. He heard whispers in Italian, words he understood perfectly, threats, warnings, and references to the children of Sodder. George's blood ran cold. He had walked straight into the territory of those responsible for his family's nightmare, but his outrage overpowered fear. With careful steps, he pressed closer, hoping to catch a glimpse of the missing children. Through a dusty window, he saw movement, 5 small figures huddled together. His heart leapt. They were alive. His children. Suddenly, a man appeared behind him, tall, broad, and silent. George froze. The intruder spoke in Italian, a voice laced with menace. If you take one step closer, you will regret it. George's instinct was to retreat, but anger and desperation propelled him forward. A struggle ensued, brief but intense. George's hands fought the shadowy figure. A gunshot rang out, and George ducked, narrowly avoiding disaster. In the chaos, the figures he had seen inside vanished. He couldn't be sure if they were taken again, or had hidden themselves in fear. He escaped into the night, lungs burning, mind racing. The confrontation confirmed what he had suspected all along. The fire had been deliberate. His children were taken for reasons beyond vengeance, political, personal, and sinister. Those responsible had influence, allies in positions of authority, and had operated with precision for decades. Returning home, George made a vow he would not stop. Every warning, every threat, every shadowed figure only strengthened his resolve. The fire had taken much, but it had not taken his courage. His children were alive, and he would uncover the network that had stolen them, no matter the cost. As he stood at the ruins of his home, gazing at the charred remains of the past, George Sodder understood the depth of the danger, but also the truth that had driven him all these years. Some things are worth defying death itself. Decades had passed since the night the Sodder house burned. George had aged, lines etched deep into his face. But the fire inside him, the relentless drive to find his children, had never dimmed. Every lead, every threat, every shadow he had faced had only strengthened his resolve. He knew now that the flames that consumed his home had not been a tragic accident. They had been a warning, a message delivered by enemies who had grown powerful and silent over years of manipulation. George never stopped searching. Every photo, every letter, every eyewitness account became a piece of a puzzle that stretched across multiple states. Slowly, he discovered evidence of the network. Responsible, children moved under false names, records destroyed or altered, and adults who had sworn secrecy to those in power. He realized that corruption, fear, and revenge had intertwined in a web that spanned decades. The clues were tantalizing. Sightings of children in Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia, letters with postmarks from faraway towns, and even photographs sent anonymously suggested survival, but always just out of reach. Those behind the abductions were careful, patient, and ruthless. George understood that confronting them directly could cost his life. But the thought of abandoning his children was unthinkable. In his final years, George became a symbol both to his remaining children and to the community. A man who had spoken too loudly, who had dared to challenge authority, and who had refused to accept injustice. He never found all the answers, never fully unraveled the conspiracy, but he left a trail for others to follow. His billboards, letters, and public appeals kept the story alive, ensuring that the disappearance of the Sodder children would not be forgotten. George Sodder died a man who refused silence. His voice, once scorned and ignored, had echoed through decades of mystery, warning, and unanswered questions. Though some of his children may never have returned, His courage and determination left an enduring legacy that even in the face of fire, threats, and conspiracies, the pursuit of truth could never be extinguished. And in the ashes of his home, in the hearts of those who remembered, George Sodder's story remains a chilling reminder that when warnings are ignored and enemies are made, courage can become the only weapon left.